In this video, we are going to configure our labeling project by building our ontology and adding data to our project. This walkthrough is motivated by a typical business use case around equipment detection for piping systems at an oil and gas company. These piping systems can be found within extraction sites in order to transport oil and gas from underground reserves to the surface, as well as refineries, where pipes transfer crude oil between different processing units. Our end goal is to train an equipment detection model that can identify three key objects within a traditional piping system. Here's an example of such an image with the corresponding objects. The first object of interest is the elbow. These are the curved fittings connecting the two pipes at an angle and allows for changes in the direction of the pipe. The second object is the flange. These are the components with bolts that connect pipes, valves, pumps, and other equipment together, typically found at the ends of pipes. Which brings us to our third object, the pipe. These are the long, cylindrical elements that transport the fluid and connect the entire system together. Now that we've seen what we're building toward, we will construct our annotation and labeling project to reflect these three objects. The first step is to click on New Project and choose the image data type. We can name this as Equipment Detection. Hit Save. And we'll go ahead and configure the ontology, which can be done by clicking on Settings, select and Setup, and New Ontology. We can name this as Equipment Detection Ontology. And we want to select the objects of interest. So in this case, this would be the elbow. And we want a bounding box. We also want the pipe as a bounding box. And we want the flange as a bounding box. And those are our three objects of interest. So we'll hit Save. And we've now configured the ontology. The next step would be to add data to the project. The first task is to ingest our dataset of images into Labelbox. There are a few different options for doing this task. If we have our dataset locally, then we can simply upload our data through local upload. The way we would do that is by clicking on New Dataset, choosing Files to Upload, assuming these are all our files. We can hit Open, name our dataset, and start upload. And this will go ahead and kick off that upload job. Alternatively, and the preferred way to ingest data for this exercise is to run the cells of code that accompany the script in this guide. So over here, we want to run all the cells under this section for uploading images to catalog. And if we do that and then scroll all the way down, we can see the cell to create the dataset within Labelbox, and then to actually upload the data rows or images themselves to that dataset. So now this is creating the upload list, and once this is finished running, we'll be able to see all of our data within the platform. Now that we've created our project and built our ontology, the next step is to choose and prioritize what data we want to label. And we can do that by taking advantage of the data curation and intelligent filtering capabilities within Labelbox catalog. So if you'll notice in this dataset, we have some images where the entire piping system is being shown, and it's also showing all instances of the classes that we're trying to predict. So the pipes, the elbows, and the flanges. And we can see such examples like this yellow image, this red one, and this blue one as well. But there are also images that don't show any of these assets. They just show some sort of brown corrosion, as we can see in this entire row, as well as in this row. And so it's very likely that these types of images may have a negative downstream impact on the model that we're trying to train. And so logically, we may want to remove or exclude them from the annotation phase. So there are a couple of options here. we can either deal directly with the data we don't want by deleting or tagging them in some sort of fashion, or we can deal with them indirectly by ignoring them entirely and only focusing on the data that we do want. And so for the first option, what we can do is we can select some of the images that we don't want, and we'll go ahead and do a similar to selection filter. And notice now how I'm getting a lot more images like the ones that I chose. And I can toggle the confidence to be more indicative of the result. And what I can do now is select all of these and hit delete. So if I wanted to delete these entire images entirely, I can go ahead and do that. Or I can apply some sort of tag. So if I wanted to add a metadata field, and I can do the one for equipment present, and none of these images have the equipment present. And so I can hit false and then apply the metadata tag for that. And so that's an option that we can use. We can also save this result as a slice. And so any new images that get added that meet this filtering criteria, in other words, they are similar to these three images at a 90% confidence threshold, then they'll automatically be added to that slice, and we can ignore them for the future. So we don't have to do this step again and again. So those are some options for dealing with the data that we don't want directly. The other option is to deal with it indirectly. So we can go ahead and deselect all of our records, and we'll choose the ones that we do want to label and train on. So images like this one and this one, and once again we'll do a similarity search, and we see images where the entire structure is present. And once again, we can toggle the confidence here. And the step from here would be to select all of these and add the batch to the project. So if you'll notice over here, I can choose my project and choose my priority. So now what this is saying is if I choose a priority of 1, then all of these images are going to be surfaced to the labelers first. So this allows us to choose and prioritize if we want to label these types of images in the beginning. So that's one option. We can go ahead and do that. The other option is to take advantage of the natural language filters within the product. So we can, once again, deselect all of these and hit natural language. And from here, let's say I want to find all images of pipes. I can see how that has returned from 292 to 137. And notice how I'm still getting some images of corrosion and no pipes. So I can once again maybe toggle the confidence to be something higher. And I'm seeing the results being filtered even further. Can do it even more. And the filter just gets better and better. So from here I can select all of these and once again add either the same priority or a different priority, choosing the right project, and hit submit. So you can go ahead and do that. Same thing for if we wanted to try out flange. We can see the flanges being narrowed down from 292 to 15, and once again select all of these and add the batch to the project and set the priority to be 1 or 2 or 3 depending on how you feel appropriate, and we can go ahead and put this as initial labeling task and hit submit. So those are some options and examples for how we can take our larger data set, perform some sort of EDA or exploratory data analysis to narrow down what data we want to label and how importantly we want to label that data by toggling the priority. And in the next step, we'll see how we can go ahead and label this data from scratch. In the previous videos, we explored how to curate and prioritize our data for labeling. The goal of this video is to show how we can take a human-in-the-loop approach to label and speed up the annotation process within Labelbox. I've curated a slice here which I feel is indicative of all three of the object classes that we're trying to predict for our use case. As a reminder, those object classes are the pipe, the elbow, and the flange. From here, we can select all of our images and send them to a labeling project. I choose my project, select the initial labeling task, and set the priority to be 1. After hitting submit, I can navigate to annotate, choose the project, and then click start labeling. From here, I can choose the feature that I'd like to label. In this case, if I want to start with the elbow, I can choose elbow and draw a bounding box around it. I can take advantage of the hotkey, so by pressing the number 2, that chooses the pipe feature, and I can go ahead and start labeling all the pipes within the image. And similarly, if I want to start labeling the flange, I can choose 3 and start labeling the flanges. Once I've labeled all of my key points of interest, I can hit submit, and this will take me to the next data row, and I can continue doing this across all of my images. Once I've done this across all of my images, I can then use all of these labels as a baseline to figure out which foundational model I can use within Foundry to help speed up the labeling process. So going back to catalog, I can configure my slice. I can use all of my images that I selected and select predict with Foundry. Now what this will do is it will navigate me to the foundational model page, and we can see the different models by task. In this case, we want object detection models, so I'll click on that. And let's say I want to start with grounding dyno. So I can choose grounding dyno, select the ontology, and generate preview if I wanted to get a preview of what that looks like. And while that's running, we can see that if I wanted to save this particular configuration, which means the model name as well as the prompt and the bounding box threshold, I can save this as an app and name the app. So that way, if I wanted to rerun this inference job, I can simply choose that app configuration. So grounding dyno returned with the preview, and we can see the bounding boxes being drawn across our images. We see instances of pipes as well as flanges across our different assets. So assuming this looks good, we can now hit submit, and this will generate the inference job on the entire data set. So right now it's only done it on 5 as a preview. This will go ahead and do it for the entire data set. So once we hit submit, we can see the result of our labeling job by clicking on the notifications tab and then navigating to our appropriate inference job. So if we click on this, this is the result of running grounding dyno on the 34 images. And if we click into a specific image, we can see the annotations that have been made as well as the predictions. So the annotations are in green. If I toggle this icon, I can see the predictions that were made by grounding dyno, along with the confidences for each class. And similarly, if I wanted to toggle and just look at the annotations, I can see those as well. So as we can see, grounding dyno zero-shot classification object detection model does a pretty solid job in being able to identify these key points of interest. If we wanted to use a different foundational model, we could do the exact same step. We would simply go over to our data. We would select all again and click on Foundry, and then choose different object detection models. So if we wanted to use the owl vision transformer, we could do that as well, and hit submit. And this will now generate two different inference jobs on two different foundational models. Now that we've tested two different object detection foundational models in Grounding Dino and Owl Vision Transformer, the next step is to evaluate which model did a better job in labeling our sample set of 34 images. Once we've determined this, we can use the corresponding model to help us label the rest of our dataset. There are a couple ways we can evaluate which model did a better job. In Catalog, we can choose the model filter and then select the corresponding model name and model run. We can see the predictions made by Grounding Dino in red and the annotations that we had made earlier in the video in green. Notice how there's a considerable amount of overlap between the predictions and the annotations. Now let's see how Owl Vision Transformer did. Clicking on Model, we can select the model name and the model run. Notice how there are only annotations that are showing up and no predictions. This means that Owl Vision Transformer didn't return any predictions for this task. Visually, we can see that Grounding Dino is better suited for this use case. We can also validate which model is better empirically by creating a model experiment with the Labelbox model. Let's navigate to the Model tab and click Create, New Experiment. We can name this as Foundation Model Evaluation and choose our ontology. Let's hit Create Model. The next step is to create a model run. Think of a model run as a container for the predictions, annotations, and corresponding metrics of a specific experiment in your ML model development cycle. In our case, we have two experiments, Grounding Dino and OwlVit. So we're going to see how to bring in the predictions from each model and the ground truth annotations in order to empirically see which model is better, based upon the evaluation metrics that Labelbox will calculate. In the corresponding script, we first need to retrieve the source model ID. This corresponds to the Grounding Dino model ID within Labelbox. We can find this by navigating to Labelbox, going to Model, clicking on Grounding Dino, and then choosing the model run. The model ID is found over here, and we would also need the model run ID, which can be found by clicking on Copy Model Run ID and then pasting that value over here. Lastly, we need the project ID, which can be found by navigating to the project and retrieving the value found over here. Once we have all three values, the next step is to generate an export for the Model Foundry run that contains some predictions. In this case, this is referring to the Grounding Dino predictions made across all the images, as well as the associated metadata. We also need to generate an export for all the ground truth annotations from our project that we had created earlier. By filtering on the workflow status being done, we're exporting all of the labels in the done stage. Once we run that cell, we then need to retrieve the IDs for all of the images in this model run for Grounding Dino. Once we have that, we need to iterate through the export that we created over here in order to parse out the metadata and only retrieve the bounding box values for each of the images. We need to do a similar thing for the ground truth labels in the project that we had created as well. This is generating the label payload, which will then be upserting into our model run. Finally, we need to get the destination model ID. This can be found by going to the model that we had created earlier and retrieving this value. We can paste that over here, and then we can name our model run as grounding dyno. Let's run this cell. And what this is doing is creating a model run called grounding dyno tied to that model. We then need to run this cell in order to upsort the data rows that exist in Model Foundry. So this is upsorting all of the images that were in this model run. And this cell is going ahead and actually importing all of the predictions that we had generated over here. Once this cell is finished running, we can see the status, and finally we need to bring in the annotations, which can be done by running this cell. Once this cell is finished running, we can navigate back to our foundation model evaluation, and if we refresh the page, we can see that our data is now there, along with the grounding dyno predictions as well as the annotations. And this is the grounding dyno model name that we had specified over here. And if we click on metrics, we can see the evaluation metrics that have automatically been calculated by Labelbox over here. Now we can do the exact same thing for our vision transformer, where we would need to change the source model ID and the source model run, and then change the name to be our vision transformer. And then once we do that, we'll be able to compare grounding dyno with our vision transformer, and it's very empirically evident that grounding dyno is the better model for this task. Now that we've determined that grounding dyno is the best foundational model for our task, we're going to use it to label the rest of our data. So you go back to catalog, we filter on all images that don't have an annotation, we select all these images, predict with Foundry, choose our model, select the ontology, and hit submit, and this will generate pre-labels for the rest of our unlabeled dataset. Now once this is finished, we can go to our model playground, choose grounding dyno, choose the most recent model run, and we see that grounding dyno has now come up with pre-labels for all of our images. We can select all of these and send them over to our labeling project. So we can send this as an initial labeling task, where the labelers will now see these pre-labels and will be able to make updates or changes to them as they feel appropriate. We want to include the model predictions, and we want to set the priority to be 1. And if we already have annotations, we just want to override, and we'll hit submit. So now this is going to send all of these pre-labeled images to our project. So now we click into the project and we see the 800 plus labels in our queue, and we hit start labeling, and we can see the pre-labels that have been generated from grounding dyno, and a labeler can come in and either approve this as is or make modifications. If they don't like a label or they want to move a particular label, they can go ahead and do that and hit submit, and keep doing this for all the images. So we can now see all of the ground truth annotations that we had previously made across all of our images, which means we've completed the first half of setting up and configuring our model experiments and model runs. The reason I say first half is because notice how there aren't any metrics right now that are being calculated when it comes to precision, recall, F1 score. That's because we only have the labels right now. We don't have any of the predictions. And so in our next steps, we're going to take all of this label data, we're going to train our model on it, and then we're going to make predictions on these data, so that once we have those predictions, we'll bring them back into this experiment, into this model run, and that way Labelbox can calculate those evaluation metrics and we can see where the model is going wrong. Now, a couple of quick visual elements that we can take advantage of while we're here in model is if I wanted to navigate to the projector view, I could see different groups or clusters of my different classes. And in this case, we see there are 3 different clusters, which aligns with our expectation because we have 3 different classes across pipe, elbows, and flanges. Now I can see areas where there might be outliers within each cluster. If I wanted to, I could chain this with a specific annotation. So if I wanted to now only focus on pipes, I can see that visual representation as well. Now I have clusters within pipes, and if I wanted to maybe focus in on this area because I feel like, this area, these pipes are relatively away from a cluster, you can go ahead and select all of those, click on Manage Selection. Now maybe I might want my reviewers to relook at these assets. So I can send this over to Annotate. I can say, as the initial review task, I can set the priority to be 1. And now that allows me to take this visual, an action upon this visual representation of my data into something that a labeler can rectify. So now that we've taken a look at some of the visual capabilities within Model, we can navigate and shift gears to the notebook. So we're now ready to download annotations from Model 1 and run all the blocks of code under this section. And so the first thing we need to do is retrieve the ontology ID, which can be found over here. So a couple of different ways. We can navigate to the project, click on settings, and if we hit edit, there's a way to copy the ID from here. Or we can go into schema, click on the ontology, and we can fetch the ID from here. Either way works. So once I have that, I can paste it over here. And I also need to retrieve the model run ID, which can be found navigating to my experiment, and I can click on copy model run ID. And once I have that, I can paste that over here. And this instantiates the session to Labelbox along with those parameters. This chunk of code will go ahead and vectorize our different classes, so assign numerical values to each of those classes. And now what this is doing is it's taking all of those annotations from the model run and bringing them into this notebook. So we can see, going back to our model, if I wanted to go ahead and deselect all of these and select all of these images. So clicking this export data button is the UI equivalent of programmatically exporting all of these labels. So whether I decide to do it from the UI over there or over here, these are equivalent. And I can go ahead and see all of the different bounding boxes across all of the images in this JSON payload. I can also retrieve the data splits for my different images, which can be found over here. And as a sanity check, we can go ahead and retrieve an example image. So I'll go ahead and specify the first image. You can see the path for that over here. And I can go ahead and iterate through my data.json payload, construct the X and Y coordinates for the bounding boxes, and pass that over as a rectangle, and then overlay those rectangles and those bounding boxes on the image for each image. And just to verify that our annotations are correct, I can retrieve this suffix from this path and navigate back to my annotate project and go to the equipment detection, click on data rows, and filter on the data row global key containing that suffix value. I see one image. I open that up, and I can now see the image along with the 3 annotations. There's 2 for the flanges in red and 1 for the pipe in pink. And that aligns with what we see in our notebook, where we have 2 annotations for the flange and 1 for the pipe. So we have now taken our annotations from our model run. We are now ready to train the YOLO V8 model. We're now ready to train our YOLO V8 model, and we can start by running the cells of code that correspond to the model training. So let's go ahead and run this cell. It has important functions for converting the Labelbox annotations to the YOLO V8 specific format. So we'll run that. We'll go ahead and run this cell as well. This is formatting our older structure in S3. So the base path can be found over here. This will be where the YOLO V8 metadata will be stored at this path, which can be found over here. And the next step would be to actually run the code for generating the annotations to YOLO format. So we can see that is being done over here. Once this is done, we'll go ahead and verify the output paths. Once the annotations have been converted to the YOLO V8 format, we can verify that the folder structure has been generated as our intention. Go ahead and click this cell, and this will show us a subset of those images and those annotations. We can also verify that by going into our folder and seeing the two folders for images and labels that are now created. We can click into images, we can see our splits. If we click into a specific folder, we can see that as well. And same thing for the labels. We have our splits, and then we have the labels themselves. We can also verify that all our images are there. So we see the splits across training, test, and validation over here, and that aligns with the splits that we have in our UI. So we can run that, and now we need to create a YAML config file which contains this information. Once we have created this YAML file, we can go ahead and upload that into this folder, the config folder, and name it as such. This has information about the path, so the actual data, images, and labels that we just created up above, as well as the splits and the number of classes and what are the classes we're trying to predict. Once we've gone ahead and done this, and we can also see additional details for training by clicking on this URL. So you can click this cell. This goes ahead and instantiates the right resources, and we can click this cell to kickstart the training process. This is the data that is specified at the YAML config file. We are also specifying the number of epochs and the project, the name, and the device type. Now, once this is done, once the training is finished, we'll be able to see the model weights at this path, and we can go ahead and copy that weights to a cloud folder so that we can have access to this in the future. And once this is finished running, we'll be able to move on to the next section. We can now see that our training has completed and our results are now saved to this path. So if we were to navigate to S3, we can see that in our model weights, we now have this folder and this best weights file. So we can go ahead and load that into our model and actually run inference using this trained model on our unlabeled data. So you can go ahead and click this cell, and now this will trigger the inference job on the model that we've trained on our data. Now once this is done, we can go ahead and see what some example images look like. Now that we've finished running inference on all of our images, we can go ahead and see the predictions in S3. So if I were to navigate here, I can navigate to the predictions folder, and I can see the predictions that have been made. As a sanity check, we can go ahead and run these cells just to retrieve all the images, and we can plot a sample image just to see what that looks like. So you can see over here, this is the pipe that has been predicted with 75% confidence, as well as the elbow with 27% confidence. So one alternative to the run inference workflow that we've just seen is we can actually take the model weights that correspond to our trained model. we can take those model weights and deploy them within Foundry as a custom model. So if you'll see over here, we have this YOLO V8 object detection oil gas accelerator model, and that corresponds to this model over here. Now, we can see this difference. Normally, if we were to click on YOLO V8 object detection, we see the 50 plus classes that YOLO V8 has been pre-trained to pick up on. So we see those over here. But if we were to navigate to our custom model, we see the 3 objects of interest that we want to classify, which are the elbow, the pipe, and the flange. So this is beneficial because we can now take this custom model and we can run our predictions on it. And notice over here, we are now generating and running inference using our custom model. Instead of having to run inference and create those images and store them within this folder, we are now able to do everything within Labelbox in terms of the inference. If this is interesting and there's a need to be able to do this within Labelbox, then please reach out to the Labelbox support team. We will be happy to assist with deploying your model, your custom model within Foundry. We can see over here, this is just one example of how we have done this, is by pointing to the specific model weights path and deploying that within the Labelbox hosting service. Now that we've created our predictions, the final step is to take these predictions and upload them to Labelbox model. We can do this by running the blocks of code within this section. And what this is going to do is generate the prediction payload for each of the bounding boxes within each image. And we're creating this list that's tying each of these images to their corresponding prediction bounding boxes. Now, once we have this list, we can simply run the model run.addPredictions API, which will go ahead and import these predictions to Labelbox model. Now, once this is run, we'll be able to see the predictions within the UI. So we can see over here, these are the predictions in red. We can toggle them on or off, as well as the annotations. Now, if we remember earlier in the video, we were only able to see the annotations, which were in green. We're now able to see the predictions in red. So this completes the loop of bringing our data in, annotating it, doing our training outside in Databricks Notebook, and then bringing those predictions back into Labelbox. We can see the evaluation metrics over here, as well as if we wanted to drill down into specific misclassifications, we can do that over there and select a subset of these and find similar such records in catalog. So what this is saying is these are potentially unlabeled data that we want to fix, because very likely the model will not do a good job in making predictions on these assets because they're similar to these images. And so what we can do is, once again, choose all those images and send that to a labeling project. In this tutorial, we saw how to ingest a sample data set for an equipment and corrosion detection use case. We saw how to perform exploratory data analysis on this data to curate. We then saw how to use a foundational model in Foundry to pre-label our data. In our case, Grounding Dyno was the most effective foundation model for our task. We then explored how to use Grounding Dyno zero-shot pre-labels with a human-in-the-loop workflow, where humans could come in and iterate or modify any sort of pre-labels or errors that Grounding Dyno may have made. Once this workflow was finished, we were able to export these annotations to train a YOLO V8 model. Once the YOLO V8 model was trained, we saw 2 different ways in which we could run inference from the model. The first way was through our Databricks notebook, and the second way was by taking the model we created, the weights from that model, and deploying that within Foundry. Both methods ultimately reached the same end goal of running inference but by doing it within Foundry, we're able to close the loop and get the entire system to be as end-to-end within Labelbox as possible. Once our model has run inference, we were able to compare that with the ground truth annotations to see where the model wasn't doing a great job. We can continue doing this again and again until we have our final hardened model.